I need a cook. Your kids need a home. The old man said it before she could even set down her bag. 3 days later, the first blizzard of the season would bury Coldiron Ranch under 4 feet of snow. And the widow standing on that porch had no idea she was the only reason anyone inside that house would still be breathing by morning. Her name was Ruth Calloway. 29 years old. 2 children, and a husband buried 6 weeks earlier after a wagon accident on the Cheyenne Road. She had $11, a sack of flour, and nowhere left to go. The rancher's name was Silas Coldiron, 71, half-blind in one eye, and stubborn enough to still be working land that should have killed him twice already. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a trade. What Ruth didn't know was that Silas had buried 3 hired hands who couldn't survive a Wyoming winter, and he was about to find out if a widow could do what they couldn't. Before we get into this one, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the story that'll make you glad you did. There's a reason this one's still being talked about in Wyoming ranching circles more than a century later. Let's get into it. The wind came off the bee-horns that October morning, carrying a smell Ruth Calloway had learned to fear, the metallic bite of an early freeze. She stood at the edge of Coldiron Ranch with her son gripping one hand and her daughter clutching the hem of her skirt, and she told herself this would be the last porch she knocked on. If this door closed too, she didn't know what came next. 6 weeks earlier, she'd buried her husband on a hillside outside Cheyenne. 3 weeks after that, the bank had taken the wagon, the mule, and every dollar the family had ever saved. What remained fit into a single canvas sack. She'd walked for 4 days to reach this ranch. And what she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, was that the man waiting on that porch had already buried 3 men who thought they could survive a winter here. She was about to become the 4th test. Silas Coldiron didn't rise from his chair when she approached. He was 71 years old, blind in one eye from a rope burned decades back, and he studied her the way a man studies a horse he's not sure he can trust with a saddle. I need a cook, he said. Before kids need a home. He said it flat, like a fact and not an offer, and for a moment Ruth thought she'd misheard him. Men on the frontier didn't usually say things plainly. They circled a question until you either walked away or agreed to something you didn't fully understand. But Silas Coldiron wasn't circling. He nodded toward the barn behind him, half its roofline sagging under years of neglect, and told her that the last man who'd worked this kitchen had frozen to death checking the calving pens during a whiteout 2 winters back. He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Without weight, without apology. Ruth felt her daughter's grip tighten around her hand. What Ruth didn't ask and what Silas didn't offer was the real reason the ranch had gone through 3 hired hands in 4 years. It wasn't bad luck. Coldiron Ranch sat in a pocket of the valley where the wind funneled down off the ridge with a force that stripped snow clean off the high ground and dumped it in drifts 12 feet deep along the northern fence line. Every man who'd come before had looked at the ranch and seen land that needed muscle. None of them had looked long enough to see what it actually needed, and by the time they understood their mistake, the season had already turned against them. Silas knew this. He'd buried men who never figured it out in time. What he didn't know, not yet, was whether the thin, wind-burned widow standing in front of him carried something the others hadn't. The kind of patience that comes from watching, not fighting, the land in front of you. Ruth said yes before she'd seen the inside of the house. She had $11 left in the world and 2 children who hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days, and pride was a luxury she'd buried along with her husband. Silas led them through a kitchen that smelled of cold ash and old grease, past a pantry with more empty shelves than full ones, and into a back room where 2 cots sat beneath a window with a crack running clean through the glass. He didn't apologize for the state of it. He simply said the work started at first light, and that supper would need to stretch further than it looked like it could. Ruth set her sack down on the narrower cot and looked at her son, who was already staring toward the kitchen with the particular hunger of a boy who hadn't complained once in 4 days of walking. She promised herself silently that whatever this ranch needed from her, she would give it. Because the alternative was a road with nowhere left to lead. By the second morning, Ruth understood she hadn't just been hired to cook. She rose before the sun and found the kitchen fire dead, the flour bin nearly empty, and a foreman named Cyrus Deal leaning against the doorframe with the look of a man waiting to be proven right about something. He'd worked Coldiron Ranch for 6 years, longer than any hired hand who'd come and gone. and he made it clear within the first 10 minutes that he didn't think a grieving widow with 2 young children belonged anywhere near a ranch heading into its hardest season. "Old man's getting soft," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear, before walking out to the corrals without waiting for a reply. Ruth said nothing. She'd learned in the 6 weeks since her husband's death that arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind only wasted breath she couldn't spare. Instead, she turned toward the pantry, took stock of what little remained, and began stretching 4 eggs and a half sack of cornmeal into something that would feed 6 mouths through a long day of work. She didn't yet know that Cyrus Deal's doubt would matter far more than his opinion of her cooking. That same afternoon, Silas took her on a slow walk around the property, pointing out the barn, the well, the calving shed, and the long fence line that vanished toward the northern ridge. He talked about the ranch the way a man talks about something he loves and is losing at the same time. Matter of fact, but with a weight underneath the words. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the well had started drawing slower each week, that the hay stores were running thinner than they should be for this time of year, and that the northern windbreak hadn't been repaired since before his wife died. Ruth listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to listen to her late husband when he worked through a problem out loud. And then Silas stopped walking, turned toward the ridge where the clouds were beginning to gather low and gray, and said something that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. He said the old-timers used to watch the geese to know how bad a winter would be, and this year, the geese had already gone. Ruth followed his gaze toward the empty sky. And for the first time since arriving at Coldiron Ranch, she understood that the danger here wasn't just poverty, or grief, or a foreman who didn't want her there. It was something bigger, something already moving toward them from beyond the ridge. And neither the old man beside her was going to wait for her to be ready. The geese were gone. And by the third morning, so was any doubt in Ruth's mind that this winter meant to arrive early and mean it. She woke before dawn to find frost already thick on the inside of the window glass, something she hadn't seen this early in the season even during the hardest years back in Cheyenne. She dressed quickly, checked on her children still asleep beneath the thin quilt, and stepped into a kitchen where Silas was already sitting at the table, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. He didn't greet her. He simply said that he'd walked the northern fence line before sunrise and found ice already forming along the water trough. 3 weeks earlier than it had any right to. Ruth felt something tighten in her chest. The same feeling she'd carried the morning her husband rode out to check on those trapped heifers and never came home. She didn't say it out loud. She'd learned that fear spoken aloud on a ranch had a way of spreading faster than the cold itself. Cyrus Deal didn't share Silas's concern, or if he did, he buried it under the same stubborn pride that had kept him running this ranch his own way for 6 years. When Ruth suggested, carefully, that the hay stacked along the west wall of the barn looked like it was sitting too close to the ground to stay dry through a hard freeze, he laughed in a way that wasn't really a laugh at all. "Been doing this since before you could walk," he told her. Not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Don't need a cook telling me how to stack hay." Ruth didn't argue. She'd learned, too, that some men needed to be wrong before they could be convinced, and she suspected Cyrus Deal was about to get his chance. What she didn't expect was how soon that chance would come, or how much it would cost before it was over. She turned her attention instead to the kitchen. Because a kitchen was a language she understood better than any argument with a foreman who'd already decided what kind of woman she was before she'd said 100 words to him. She found a root cellar half-collapsed on one side, its shelves lined with potatoes that had already begun sprouting pale, hungry shoots in the damp air. She found a smokehouse with more gaps in its boards than wall, letting in enough draft to spoil meat that should have lasted the whole season. And she found, tucked behind a broken churn, a stack of old ledgers written in a woman's careful hand. Silas's late wife, she realized, flipping through pages of recipes and remedies and small notes about the land that read less like a diary and more like a survival manual, passed down and then forgotten. Ruth sat with those ledgers longer than she meant to, and when she finally closed the last one, she understood something about this ranch that even Silas hadn't said out loud. It hadn't fallen apart because of bad luck. It had fallen apart because no one had picked up where his wife left off that evening. Ruth made a decision that would either save her position on this ranch or end it before the first real snow arrived. She waited until supper was cleared, until her children were settled by the fire with full stomachs for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit to do. And then she asked Silas if she could speak plainly. He nodded, the same flat, unreadable nod he'd given her the day she arrived, and Ruth laid out everything she'd found. The root cellar, the smokehouse, the hay stacked wrong. Do. The water line that would freeze solid within the week if nothing changed. She expected him to dismiss her the way Cyrus had. Instead, sat quietly for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his do. And then he asked her a question she hadn't prepared for. He asked her how she knew all of this. A rancher's wife's knowledge, from a woman who'd spent her married years keeping a small cabin, not running 1,500 acres of open range. Do. Ruth hesitated only a second before answering that her husband had taught her to read land the same way he read weather, and that watching him die trying to save 2 heifers had taught her the rest. Silas didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her for a long time. Could do. The way a man looks at something he's trying to decide whether to trust with everything he has left. The next morning, everything changed, though not in the way Ruth expected. Silas gathered Cyrus and the 2 remaining hired hands in the yard before sunrise and told them, could do, without raising his voice, that the widow's word carried the same weight as his own on this ranch from now until the thaw. Cyrus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, not with Silas standing right there. Do. And Ruth understood that his silence was an agreement. It was a debt being quietly recorded, one he intended to collect later. She didn't have time to worry about it. There was too much work ahead, and too little season left to do it in. Could do. She set the hands to rebuilding the haystack on raised rails to keep it clear of the wet ground, sealing the smokehouse gaps with clay and ash the way her husband once showed her. Do. And clearing the root cellar drainage so the potatoes would keep through months of hard freeze instead of rotting before Christmas. Every task she gave was small. They were the difference between a ranch that survived winter and one that didn't. It was Eli, too, her son, who found the first real sign that something worse than an early frost was coming. He'd been sent to check the water trough at dusk, a simple chore Ruth had given him to keep him useful and close to the house, and he came running back across the yard, so fast he nearly fell twice in the dark. He said the sky in the west had gone a color he'd never seen before, low and heavy and strange, and that the wind had gone completely still in a way that felt wrong rather than calm. Ruth stepped outside and felt it too. That particular silence that sits just before a storm decides to stop warning you and simply arrive. She looked toward Silas, who had already come out onto the porch, his good eye fixed on the same darkening horizon. And neither of them said what they were both thinking. They didn't need to. The land had already told them everything, the same way it had told 3 men before Ruth who never made it to spring. I want to know what you think Cyrus' deal is really planning. Is he going to come around, or is his pride going to cost this ranch something none of them can afford to lose? Drop your guess in the comments, and while you're there, tell me about a time someone judged you wrong before they knew your story. Because Ruth Calloway was about to find out that surviving the winter would be the easy part. The stillness didn't last past midnight. Ruth woke to a sound she'd only heard once before in her life, the night her husband described a storm rolling off the Powder River country years earlier. A low, grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As if the sky itself had turned to something solid and was dragging itself across the land. She was on her feet before she fully understood why, pulling her children from their cots, wrapping them in every blanket the room held. When Silas's voice cut through the house from the front porch, sharp in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. Get them to the root cellar, he shouted, and Ruth didn't ask questions. She'd learned enough about this man in 2 weeks to know he didn't raise his voice over nothing. The wind hit the house like something with intention behind it. Not the steady push of an ordinary storm, but a series of hammer blows that rattled the windows in their frames and sent snow hissing through gaps in the chinking Ruth hadn't yet found time to seal. Somewhere out past the yard, she heard a crack that didn't belong to wood settling or ice forming. It was sharper, more final. And she realized a moment later it was the sound of the North Corral fence giving way under a drift that had built faster than anyone could have prepared for. Cyrus burst through the kitchen door with frost already crusting his eyebrows, shouting that 2 of the milk cows had bolted through the broken rail and were somewhere out in the whiteout. And for the first time since Ruth had arrived at Coldiron Ranch, she saw real fear on his face instead of pride. Even in the chaos, that fear had a way of stripping men down to what they actually were underneath all that posturing. And she wondered which version of Cyrus' deal was about to walk out into that storm. Do. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a coil of rope from the wall, started toward the door, despite his blind eye and 71 years. And Ruth understood in that instant that he intended to go out into a blizzard that had already swallowed the barn from view. Do. Chasing cattle he couldn't fully see even in daylight. She stepped in front of him before she'd decided to, one hand flat against his chest, and told him plainly that he'd be no use to this ranch frozen in a snowbank. Do. He looked at her the way he had that first afternoon on the porch, weighing something, and then he handed her the rope instead. "Then you tie it," he said, "and you make sure whoever goes out there comes back in." It wasn't permission, it was a responsibility. Do. Dropped into her hands in the middle of the worst storm this ranch had seen in years, and Ruth realized there was no time left to wonder if she was ready for it. She tied the rope around Cyrus's waist herself. Do. Her hands steady even though nothing else in her felt that way, and she gave him the same instructions her husband used to give hired men before riding into rough country. 3 tugs meant trouble. Keep one hand on the rope at all times. Do. Don't chase an animal past where you can still feel the line. Cyrus looked at her for a long moment before he stepped out into the white wall beyond the door, and something in his expression had shifted from the man who'd mocked her over hay, stacking 3 days earlier. Do. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the same flat nod Silas always gave, and disappeared into the storm with the rope trailing out behind him like the only thread connecting the ranch to the 2 cows still lost somewhere in the dark. Do. Ruth stood at the door with the line running through her gloved hands, feeling every pull and shift, and she understood that the next several minutes would decide more than just whether 2 cows survived the night. The rope went taut, then slack, do. Then taut again in a pattern that told her nothing, except that Cyrus was still moving, still fighting his way forward through snow that had already buried the fence line he was following. Eli stood beside her, do. Holding a lantern that did almost nothing against a wind determined to swallow every bit of light it touched. And Ruth found herself praying in the same quiet, wordless way she had the night her husband didn't come home from the dry wash. Do. She refused to let that memory finish itself in her mind. Instead, she focused on the rope, on the small vibrations traveling up through her palms, translating a language of survival she'd learned the hard way and never wanted to learn again. Somewhere out past the porch, do. Nell's crying had turned to exhausted whimpering in Silas's arms, and the old man stood rigid at the window watching a storm that had already taken more from this ranch than he'd ever admitted out loud. Then the rope jerked hard, 3 sharp pulls in a row. Do. Exactly the signal Ruth had told Cyrus to use if something went wrong, and her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She called for Silas, already pulling the line taut. Do. Already bracing herself against the doorframe the way she'd seen ranch hands do when an animal fought against a lead rope. And for a moment the line went completely still, in a silence that felt far worse than the storm itself. Do. Eli's small hands wrapped around the rope beside hers without being asked, adding whatever strength a 7-year-old boy could offer to a rope disappearing into a blizzard that had already claimed one man from this family once before. Do. Ruth didn't let herself think about what 3 sharp tugs and then nothing might mean. She simply pulled and prayed and refused to let go. It felt like an hour passed in that doorway, though it couldn't have been more than a few desperate minutes. Do. Before something solid finally hit the rope from the other end, and Ruth felt the unmistakable weight of a body being dragged forward through the snow. She pulled harder, calling Eli to grab hold too, and out of the white wall beyond the porch steps, do. A shape finally emerged, crawling on hands and knees, one arm wrapped tight around something Ruth couldn't yet identify in the dark. It was Cyrus, and as he collapsed forward into the doorway with snow crusted across every inch of him, do. Ruth realized the thing he'd refused to let go of, even half frozen and barely conscious, was a newborn calf that shouldn't have survived being born into a blizzard at all. One of the missing cows had gone into labor somewhere out past the broken fence line. Do. And Cyrus Deal, the man who 3 days earlier hadn't trusted a widow to stack hay correctly, had crawled through a whiteout to save a life he had no obligation to save. Ruth knelt beside him in the doorway, pulling the shivering calf against her own body for warmth, do, and looked up just in time to see something change permanently in Silas Coldiron's face, because whatever this ranch had been before tonight, do, it was never going to survive the rest of this winter without every single person in that room learning to trust each other completely. And not one of them yet knew if that trust would be enough. The calf lived through the night, do, though none of them were certain it would, until the first gray light crept over the ridge, and Ruth found it standing on wobbling legs in a nest of straw beside the stove, nudging against Eli's hand as if it already understood who had carried it in from the storm. Do. Cyrus slept for nearly 12 hours straight in the room off the kitchen, his fingers still faintly blue, when Ruth checked on him at dawn, and when he finally woke, the first thing he asked wasn't about himself. He asked if the calf had made it. Ruth told him yes, it do. And something passed across his face that she hadn't seen in the 2 weeks she'd known him. Not pride, not stubbornness, but something closer to relief. The kind that only comes when a man realizes he did the one thing that actually mattered. Do. She didn't say "I told you so" about the hay, or the fence, or any of it. She simply set a bowl of broth beside his bed and let the silence say what neither of them needed to put into words. The blizzard held the ranch hostage for 2 more days. Do. Wind screaming across the flats with a fury that buried the corral fence entirely, and turned the short walk between the house and the barn into a rope-guided crawl through waist-deep drifts. But inside Coldiron Ranch, something had shifted that the storm couldn't touch. Do. Silas worked alongside Ruth, checking the smokehouse seals she'd repaired days earlier, and when he found them holding solid against wind that would have torn through the old gaps in an hour, he didn't say much. He simply nodded the way he always did. Do. But this time he let his hand rest on her shoulder for a moment longer than the gesture required. Eli had taken to following Cyrus everywhere the foreman went, carrying tools, asking questions about rope work and knots, and Cyrus, who 3 days earlier had called Ruth's advice unwanted, now explained things to her son with a patience that surprised even himself. Ruth watched all of it from the kitchen window, and understood that whatever this ranch had lost over the years, a wife, a foreman's trust, 3 hired hands who never made it to spring. It was slowly finding its way back through people who had no reason to trust each other except that the winter had left them no other choice. On the 4th morning, the wind finally dropped, and the sky over Coldiron Ranch opened into a pale, exhausted blue that felt almost unfamiliar after days of white. Silas walked the property alone before anyone else was awake, the way Ruth had learned he always did after something the ranch needed to survive. And when he returned to the kitchen, his boots caked with snow and his good eye red from the cold. He sat at the table and said nothing for a long while. Ruth poured him coffee and waited. Because she'd learned that Silas Coldiron spoke when he was ready and not a moment before. When he finally looked up, he told her that the northern fence had held. The hay had stayed dry. The root cellar hadn't lost a single potato. Every fix Ruth had pushed for in the 2 weeks before the storm had done exactly what she said it would, and the 3 men who'd worked this ranch before her, the ones Silas had buried without ever fully understanding why, might have lived if someone had simply listened the way he'd finally learned to listen to her. Word of the storm spread through the valley the way it always did on the frontier, carried by neighbors checking on each other once the roads cleared enough to travel. Men came by Coldiron Ranch over the following days expecting to find losses: a collapsed barn, dead cattle, a rancher too old and too short-handed to have survived a storm that had devastated half the county. Instead, they found a full herd, a dry hayloft, and a newborn calf standing steady in the corral as if the blizzard had never touched it. One neighbor, a hard-nosed rancher named Ezra Colton who'd lost 11 head of cattle in the storm, stood at the fence line for a long time studying the raised hay rails and the sealed smokehouse before finally asking who'd done the work. Silas didn't hesitate. He nodded toward the kitchen window, where Ruth stood with a dish towel over her shoulder, and told Ezra Colton plainly that the widow he'd hired to cook had ended up saving the whole ranch before winter had even finished proving its point. That evening, after the last of the visitors had ridden off, and the children were asleep by the fire, Silas asked Ruth to sit with him at the kitchen table, and he set down a folded piece of paper between them, the way a man sets down something he's been carrying for longer than he wants to admit. It wasn't a raise in wages. It was a formal share in the ranch itself, land, cattle, and a promise that her children would always have a home at Coldiron Ranch no matter what came next. Ruth stared at the paper for a long moment before she looked up at him. And she asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind since the day she arrived. She asked why a man who'd only wanted to cook was now offering her a piece of everything he had left in this world. Silas answered the way he answered everything, without decoration, without softening it into something easier to hear. He told her he hadn't buried 3 hired hands because the winters were too hard. He'd buried them because none of them had ever bothered to actually see the land the way she had. In the first 2 weeks she'd been here, and a ranch like this one didn't need muscle nearly as much as it needed someone willing to look closely enough to notice what was breaking before it broke. Ruth didn't cry when she signed her name beside his that night, though something in her chest finally loosened for the first time since the morning she buried her husband on that hillside outside Cheyenne. Cyrus signed as witness without being asked, and when he handed the pen to Eli so the boy could add his own small, careful signature beneath his mother's, Ruth understood that this ranch had stopped being a place she was simply passing through on her way to somewhere else. It had become the place her children would grow up, the place where a foreman who once mocked her had crawled through a blizzard to save a life that wasn't his to save, and the place where an old rancher who'd buried too many people had finally found someone the land itself seemed willing to trust. Outside, the last of the storm clouds broke apart over the ridge, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth Calloway looked toward tomorrow without any fear of what it might take from her next. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because there are so many more stories like Ruth's waiting to be told. Stories about people who found family in the last place they expected it, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know.